Most of us grow up thinking that being clean is pretty simple. Take a shower, wash your hands, keep your house tidy. Do those things, and you've probably earned the right to say, "Yeah, I'm a clean person." Japan sees it a little differently. Not because people there shower more often, not because their homes are somehow spotless all the time. The difference runs much deeper than that. In Japan, cleanliness isn't judged only by what stays on your own body. It's also judged by what your everyday habits quietly leave behind for everyone else. That's a very different way of looking at the world. Before we go any further, it's worth saying something important. These aren't strict rules that every Japanese person follows every single day. Japan is a modern country. Younger generations are changing, and people have different personalities just like anywhere else. But these are long-standing cultural habits. They've shaped everyday life for generations, and once you start noticing them, you'll see them almost everywhere. To understand why, we need to go back much further than modern Japan. One of the ideas that quietly influenced Japanese culture comes from Shinto, Japan's native belief system. It includes a concept called kegare. Now, kegare doesn't simply mean dirt. That's where a lot of explanations stop, but it's actually more interesting than that. Kegare is closer to the idea of something being out of balance, something that disrupts the natural order, or brings a sense of impurity into a place. Physical dirt is only one example. Over hundreds of years, that way of thinking helped shape Japanese architecture, etiquette, and everyday routines. Even people who never think about Shinto today still live inside many of those habits because culture has a way of surviving long after people stop talking about where it came from. As we go through these 7 habits, I want you to keep one simple idea in the back of your mind. Japan spends an incredible amount of effort protecting 3 invisible boundaries. The first is the boundary between outside and inside. The second is the boundary between private life and shared space. And the third is the boundary between personal preference and everyone else's comfort. Every habit you're about to see protects one or sometimes all 3 of those invisible lines. Once you notice them, you'll start seeing Japanese cleanliness in a completely different way. Habit 1. Wearing outdoor shoes inside the house. Let's start with the easiest one to recognize. Imagine walking across a grocery store parking lot, stopping at a gas station, maybe stepping into a public restroom, and then walking straight across your living room carpet without thinking twice. For many Americans, that's completely normal. For many Japanese people, it feels surprisingly uncomfortable. That's why almost every Japanese home begins with a genkan. Most people think it's simply the place where you take off your shoes. It is, but it's also much more than that. The genkan marks the point where one world ends and another begins. Everything outside stays outside. Everything inside deserves to stay protected. And what's interesting is that the separation doesn't stop there. Inside many Japanese homes, there are still different levels of cleanliness. You'll often find slippers for everyday indoor use, separate slippers that are only worn inside the bathroom, and rooms with tatami flooring where slippers come off completely because the floor itself is treated as part of the living space. To someone unfamiliar with Japan, that might sound overly careful, but from the Japanese point of view, it isn't really about being obsessed with dirt. It's about respecting the invisible boundaries that make a shared home feel comfortable for everyone living there. Once you understand that, taking off your shoes stops feeling like a rule. It starts feeling like a quiet way of saying, "I'm leaving the outside world outside." Habit 2. Blowing your nose in public. Here's one that surprises almost every visitor to Japan. In much of the West, if your nose starts running, you're usually taught to deal with it right away. Pull out a tissue, blow your nose, and move on. In fact, constantly sniffing is often considered the ruder option. Japan tends to see it differently. That doesn't mean blowing your nose is forbidden. It isn't. But in many public settings, especially on a crowded train, in a restaurant, or during a meeting, people often prefer to wait until they can step into a restroom or another private space. At first, that can seem backwards, but the reason goes beyond hygiene. Japanese public etiquette tries to minimize anything that suddenly draws attention to one person. Loud conversations, strong perfume, phone calls, and even certain bodily sounds are often kept as discreet as possible. It's not because these things are shameful. It's because shared spaces are expected to remain calm and comfortable for everyone using them. Think about it this way. The moment someone loudly blows their nose in a quiet train car, everyone's attention shifts, if only for a second, to that one person. In Japan, avoiding that kind of interruption is often seen as a small act of consideration. That's why you'll hear quiet sniffles much more often than loud nose blowing. It's another example of the invisible boundary between private life and shared space. The act itself isn't the problem. The place and the people around you are what matter. Habit 3. Wearing strong perfume. Now, let's talk about something you can't even see. Scent. In many Western countries, fragrance is part of personal style. A favorite perfume or cologne becomes part of how people express themselves. Sometimes it's even meant to leave an impression before you say a single word. Japan approaches it a little differently. There's a modern term you'll sometimes hear called sumahara, short for smell harassment. It refers to situations where a strong scent, whether it's perfume, cologne, fabric softener, or even body odor, becomes uncomfortable for the people sharing the same space. But this isn't really a story about perfume. It's a story about proximity. Think about daily life in Japan. Every morning, millions of people step onto crowded trains. They work in shared offices, ride packed elevators, stand shoulder to shoulder in convenience stores. When you spend that much time just inches away from strangers, even a pleasant fragrance can become overwhelming if everyone is wearing one. What feels subtle in a quiet American suburb, where people spend much of the day in their own cars or larger personal spaces, can feel surprisingly intense inside a crowded Tokyo train during rush hour. That's why many Japanese people choose fragrances that stay close to the body or skip them altogether. The goal isn't to erase your personality. It's to make sure your personal choices don't become someone else's experience. Once again, it's less about the scent itself and more about respecting the invisible boundary between personal preference and shared comfort. A quick thought before we continue. Have you noticed something? None of these habits are really about dirt, taking off your shoes, waiting to blow your nose, wearing less perfume. They're all protecting invisible boundaries that most of us never think about. The boundary between outside and inside, between private life and shared space, between expressing yourself and making sure everyone around you still feels comfortable. And as we keep going, you'll see that same pattern appear again and again. Habit 4. Eating while walking. Now here's one that catches a lot of visitors off guard. In many parts of the United States, eating while you're on the move is just part of everyday life. A coffee in one hand, a breakfast sandwich in the other. Maybe you're answering a text while crossing the parking lot. It feels efficient, like you're making the most of your time. Japan tends to see that moment differently. There is even a word for it, tabaruki, which simply means eating while walking. That doesn't mean you'll never see someone doing it. You will, especially at festivals, street food markets, or tourist areas. But in everyday public life, many people prefer to stop, finish their food, and then continue on their way. Why? Part of the answer is practical. Walking while eating makes it easier to drip food, leave crumbs, bump into people, or end up carrying sticky wrappers through crowded streets where public trash bins are surprisingly rare. But there's another reason that's a little more subtle. In Japan, food deserves your attention, and so does the space you're sharing with everyone else. When you're eating, walking, checking your phone, and navigating a crowd all at the same time, something usually loses your full attention. Maybe it's your meal. Maybe it's the people around you. Maybe it's both. Japanese culture tends to favor finishing one activity before moving on to the next, not because life should be slower, but because giving something your full attention is seen as a quiet form of respect. Respect for the food, respect for the people around you, and even respect for the shared space itself. Once again, it comes back to the same invisible boundaries we've been following all along. The goal isn't simply to avoid making a mess. It's to move through public space without asking everyone else to adjust to your routine. Habit 5. The bath isn't for getting clean. This is the habit that surprises many people the first time they experience Japan. In much of the West, a bathtub has one job. You get in, wash yourself, rinse off, and when you step out, you're clean. In Japan, those are actually two different activities. Before anyone enters the bath, they wash themselves completely. Soap, shampoo, a full rinse. Only after every trace of dirt and soap has been washed away do they step into the hot water. Because the bath isn't where cleaning happens. The bath is where the day comes to an end. That's why the same bath water can often be shared by different family members. Everyone enters already clean. The water isn't there to remove dirt. It's there to help you let go of everything you've been carrying all day. And that's the real difference. Japan separates cleaning from healing. The shower removes dirt. The bath restores the body. And, just as importantly, it gives the mind a chance to slow down. For many Japanese families, an evening bath isn't simply another hygiene routine. It's one of the few moments in the day when nothing is expected of you. No phone calls, no work, no rushing, just warm water, and permission to be still for a little while. Maybe that's why bathing occupies such a special place in Japanese daily life. It's not only about ending the day feeling cleaner, it's about ending the day feeling lighter. Once you see it that way, the bath stops looking like another place to wash. It becomes something closer to evening therapy, and once again, the invisible boundary appears. First, remove what doesn't belong on your body. Only then, give your body and your mind the chance to recover. Habit 6. The washlet revolution. If you've ever used a Japanese restroom for the first time, you probably remember the experience. A heated seat, buttons everywhere, and, of course, the famous bidet function. To many visitors, it feels like a luxury. But in Japan, the washlet became popular for a much more practical reason. It solved several everyday problems at once. Yes, water often cleans more effectively than paper alone, but that's only part of the story. For older adults whose mobility isn't what it used to be, a washlet can make everyday life more comfortable and more independent. For pregnant women, it can be gentler during a time when even simple movements become more difficult. For people recovering from surgery or dealing with certain medical conditions, it can make an ordinary daily routine far less painful. In other words, the washlet wasn't designed just to make bathrooms feel more high-tech. It was designed to make everyday life a little easier for as many people as possible. That's a pattern you'll see again and again in Japanese design. The best technology isn't always the flashiest. Sometimes it's the technology that quietly disappears into daily life because it solves a real human problem. When people outside Japan joke about high-tech toilets, they're usually noticing the features. The Japanese are often appreciating something different, the thoughtfulness behind them. Because good design isn't only about adding convenience, it's about preserving comfort, dignity, and independence, even during the most ordinary moments of the day. And once again, we're back to the same invisible boundaries. Not just keeping a space clean, but helping every person move through that space with a little more comfort and a little more respect. Habit 7. Using serving chopsticks. The last habit may seem like the smallest one of all. Imagine you're sharing a meal with family or friends. A large dish is placed in the middle of the table, and everyone helps themselves. In many countries, it's perfectly normal to reach in with the same chopsticks you're eating with. In Japan, you'll often see something different. People use a separate pair of serving chopsticks, or they simply turn their own chopsticks around and use the clean end to pick up food before switching them back. From a purely scientific point of view, you could say it's about reducing the spread of saliva, and that's certainly part of it. But if that were the whole story, this habit wouldn't carry the meaning it does. The deeper message isn't about germs, it's about intention. That tiny pause before serving yourself says something without using a single word. I remembered that other people will eat from this plate too. It's a small gesture, almost invisible, but that's exactly why it matters, because consideration becomes visible through the smallest actions. You don't have to make a grand sacrifice. You simply make one tiny adjustment so the next person feels just a little more comfortable. By itself, flipping your chopsticks doesn't change the world, but it changes the message your actions send. And in Japanese culture, those quiet messages often matter just as much as spoken words. One final thought. Looking back, it's easy to think this video was about shoes, or noses, or perfume, or baths, or toilets, or chopsticks, but none of those were really the point. The real lesson has been hiding underneath every habit we've talked about. In many Western cultures, cleanliness often begins with a simple question: am I clean? In Japan, the question quietly becomes something else. Does everyone around me still feel comfortable because of what I just did? It's a subtle shift. But once you start asking that second question, almost every habit we've seen today suddenly makes sense. Taking off your shoes, keeping your voice down, choosing a lighter fragrance, stopping to eat instead of walking, soaking in a bath after you've already washed, using serving chopsticks. None of them are really about chasing perfection. They're small, everyday ways of making shared life a little more comfortable for everyone else. And perhaps that's why Japanese cleanliness feels so different. Because at its heart, it isn't only about removing dirt. It's about quietly taking care of the people you may never even speak to. So, before we finish, I'd like to leave you with something simple. Not another Japanese custom, not another etiquette rule, just 3 questions. Think of them as the Japanese shared space test. The next time you walk into your home, step onto a train, sit down in a cafe, or simply share a space with other people. Ask yourself these 3 questions. First, did I bring something from one space into another? Maybe it's dirt on my shoes. Maybe it's noise. Maybe it's a strong scent. Maybe it's stress that I'm about to pass on to someone else. Second, did I actually solve the problem? Or did I simply move it somewhere else? Did I clean it? Or just leave it for someone else to deal with later? And finally, if everyone did exactly what I just did, would this shared space feel a little better or a little worse? The interesting thing is that these questions aren't really about Japan. They're about awareness. And perhaps that's why Japanese cleanliness feels so different. It isn't built around perfection. It's built around consideration. Every small habit quietly says, I know this space doesn't belong only to me, whether that's a home, a sidewalk, an office, or even a train filled with strangers. Maybe that's the real lesson. Cleanliness isn't only about removing dirt. Sometimes it's about making life a little easier for people you'll probably never meet. And perhaps that's the cleanest idea of all. If you enjoyed exploring the deeper thinking behind everyday Japanese life, I'd love to have you here for the next journey. Until then, thank you for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.